Welcome to the Agency for Healthcare Administration's training on compliance programs for Medicaid providers. This training focuses on compliance programs in general, as well as a subset of a provider's compliance program that the agency refers to as provider self-audits. Before we begin the training, the agency's website, located at http://ahca.myflorida.com, has valuable resources for Medicaid providers. Additionally, if you click on the Site menu, you can find the Division of Medicaid in the drop-down menu. There is information related to various Medicaid-related programs and items, including the materials and information about this and other trainings. The agency wants to ensure that providers have access to resources to assist them with their compliance efforts. Additional resources, including information about provider-type specific subject training, will also be available on the agency's website. If you have questions regarding provider compliance, please contact your local Medicaid office or the agency's Medicaid Fraud Liaison. The contact information for the agency's Medicaid Fraud Liaison is also available on the agency's website. By using the Site menu, you can navigate to the Medicaid webpage. There are quick links on the right-hand side of the main Medicaid webpage. The Fraud and Abuse quick link takes you to a page with information about reporting fraud and abuse and conducting self-audits. The MPI Self-Audit Coordinator's email address is posted on this page at ahca.myflorida.com/Medicaid/abuse/index.shtml. This presentation will cover the requirements necessary to have a program in place in order to ensure compliance with the Medicaid program rules, and why a provider would want to do a self-audit, as well as how to conduct one. This presentation is a high-level overview about establishing new compliance programs or making existing programs more formalized, and is not intended to comment on any one particular compliance program a provider may already have in place. If you are a provider who is participating in this training, you probably already understand the value to you for taking control of the process to ensure compliance with program rules. In fact, federal and state law obligate providers to ensure that the claims they submit to the Medicaid program are correct and properly reimbursed. This obligation extends to the reimbursement rules for Medicaid, as well as the laws that govern the provider's profession. A well-developed and implemented compliance program will help a provider prevent non-compliance with program rules. In doing so, a provider will also be able to identify those instances where non-compliance does occur, and allow for opportunities to remedy the non-compliance by both working to prevent reoccurrence as well as remedy the current occurrence. A provider who takes the initiative to do this on their own, as opposed to waiting for the government to identify the non-compliance, reduces the likelihood of adverse consequences such as penalties and interest, in addition to the repayment of any improper reimbursements. A provider who has an effective compliance program in place will likely minimize the risk for non-compliance, as well as oftentimes find non-compliance before the state identifies it, and may take advantage of the opportunity for amnesty from sanctions when repaying the amounts that were improperly reimbursed. Also, a provider who implements a compliance program sets the expectations for their employees to minimize the risk of your staff engaging in behavior that you will ultimately be held responsible for. The Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, has established the components of an effective compliance program. Here are the 7 key elements. First, the program should include written policies that are available and known to all employees. They should identify specific areas of risk within the provider's practice. In other words, they should be designed to address the vulnerability of the individual Medicaid provider, as opposed to being a one-size-fits-all program. Second, providers may consider designating an employee to serve as their compliance officer to be responsible for ensuring the policies and procedures are written and implemented, as well as to ensure that monitoring is routinely conducted and that staff have a central point of contact for questions and to report issues. Third, employees should be screened to avoid hiring staff with criminal histories that are not allowed for participation in the Medicaid program. Fourth, employees should be trained about anti-fraud efforts and how they can help. Fifth, providers should conduct internal monitoring and auditing of their compliance. When non-compliance is found, providers should take appropriate action regarding staff who participated in the non-compliance, and providers should create an environment where employees are encouraged to assist in the effort to ensure program compliance. And finally, number 7, providers should investigate all suspected non-compliance, take corrective action to prevent further occurrences, and should return any Medicaid reimbursements that are found to be improper. A later portion of this presentation will cover in detail how a provider can conduct these reviews and return the improper reimbursements. Further details about the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General recommendations can be found on their website at http://oig.hhs.gov. Again, oig.hhs.gov. This site has useful information for providers about general compliance issues as well as provider type specific information. Medicaid providers who submit claims for reimbursement, or providers who are paid via capitation or per diem payments, are required to adhere to Medicaid policy as well as the regulations governing the practice of their profession. When a claim is submitted, the provider is certifying that they are in compliance with the regulations. A provider may be asked at any time to demonstrate by way of documentation, which was created at the time the services were conducted or the goods were dispensed, that the reimbursement was proper, that the claim is for goods or services rendered, and rendered fully in compliance with all program rules. For a provider to fully understand how to be compliant, we believe it is necessary to understand the commonly used terms when the government talks about improper payments as a result of non-compliance with program rules. These terms are fraud, abuse, and overpayment. This overview is not intended to be a complete explanation of these terms, which are fully defined in the Florida statutes. Rather, we think it's important that you understand them generally as we begin to discuss compliance programs. Fraud is an intentional act to deceive the program, while abuse can be intentional or unintentional and includes anything that is not consistent with the practice of your profession or standard business practices. An overpayment, on the other hand, is the reference to the dollar amount that was improperly reimbursed as a result of any non-compliance, regardless of whether the non-compliance was intentional or not, or was a simple mistake or oversight. When a provider discovers that they have misbilled the Medicaid program, it is usually preferred that they simply void or adjust the claim. If only a portion of the claim was misbilled, then an adjustment would be needed. If the entire claim is misbilled, then the provider should void the claim. Voiding or adjusting the claim helps keep the claim's history accurate and will help you down the road should you ever be selected for audit by the agency. However, one caution about voiding or adjusting claims would be that if you know you are under investigation or being audited, in those situations, voiding or adjusting claims without speaking to the investigator or auditor is not recommended. Instructions on how to void and adjust claims are included in the Florida Medicaid Provider Reimbursement Handbook, CMS-1500, and the Florida Medicaid Provider Reimbursement Handbook, UB-04. If you go to the agency's homepage located at http://ahca.myflorida.com and click on the Site menu, you can find the Division of Medicaid in the drop-down menu. From the Medicaid homepage, there is a tab that allows you to navigate to the provider web portal information. The Florida Medicaid's web portal is located at www.mymedicaid-florida.com and contains the following resources for providers: Medicaid bulletins, provider alerts, Medicaid provider handbooks, fee schedules, forms, information about training, and provider enrollment. The web portal also has links to the Medicaid area offices with information by areas, publications, and training opportunities. By following the web link to public information for providers, it will navigate you to the provider homepage. From the provider homepage, click on any of the links on the left side of the page, and you will be shown the available information for providers. You can obtain the fee schedules and other important information, such as the provider handbooks. If you click on the link for handbooks, you will be taken to the page where all handbooks are listed, and, depending on your monitor, you may have to scroll down to view the list. You can then obtain and download the handbooks that are necessary for your practice. Record-related issues of noncompliance make up one of the greatest areas of risk for any provider. From failing to document all of the required elements of a service to failing to maintain the records, a provider's record keeping is the cornerstone for ensuring compliance. Without records, a provider cannot establish compliance with program rules. State Medicaid law requires the records to be maintained for 5 years. Other governing laws, such as HIPAA, require the records to be maintained for a longer period of time. A provider should be familiar with all of the relevant record retention laws and ensure that records are maintained for the longest period required. The records to be maintained include all medical, professional, financial, and business records. One of the easiest areas of noncompliance to avoid is to ensure that you maintain complete and accurate documentation regarding the delivery of all goods or services. Having a compliance program in place will help you ensure that record keeping is being done properly, because you will monitor the processes you have in place for documenting goods and services in the first place, as well as how you are maintaining those records over time. Another area of potential noncompliance, which is easily avoided, is to ensure that you keep all of your Medicaid provider enrollment information up to date. For instance, if you are planning to relocate or open a new office, if there is a sale anticipated, or if there are changes to the structural organization, such as owners, officers, directors, managing or supervising employees, or any employees who are required under Medicaid policy or other licensure or regulatory rules, such as a clinical director, make sure you are coordinating with the Medicaid program by filing the appropriate documentation, such as a change of address or change of ownership notice. Finally, when you are asked for records from Medicaid program officials, whether from the Agency for Healthcare Administration or other government entities, such as the Office of Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, or any of the Medicaid program partners or contractors working for the state or federal government, furnish the records timely and ensure that you are furnishing the complete records. You will only have one opportunity to submit a complete set of records. After that time, any additional documentation will be suspect and will likely result in sanctions for failure to have furnished the complete records at the time of the initial request. We have covered a very high-level overview of compliance requirements. We will move into the portion of this presentation that addresses how you can best minimize your risk for being found out of compliance with the program rules. Again, it is important to understand the policy rules that govern your practice area. When you find claims that are non-compliant and thus improperly reimbursed, work with the Medicaid area office staff and void the non-compliant claims whenever possible. If it isn't reasonably practical to void the claims, then you will want to do a self-disclosure, referred to as a self-audit, so that the improper reimbursements can be remedied and you can increase the likelihood that you may avoid sanctions due to non-compliance. As a reminder, however, if you know you are under review, please talk to the agency auditing before you void the claims. We do want to encourage providers to conduct internal reviews and disclose non-compliant claims. We call a provider's self-review a self-audit, and the remainder of this training will discuss why you should do self-audits and how to conduct them. A self-audit is an audit of claims that is conducted by the provider with the results sent to the agency. A self-audit should review the reimbursements from Medicaid for a specified period of time, which can be referred to as the audit period. The audit should be a detailed evaluation of the provider's Medicaid reimbursements that fall within the audit period. However, it may be focused on particular issues, referred to as a focused review, or cover all reimbursements during the audit period, referred to as a comprehensive review. Regardless of whether the audit is focused or comprehensive, all claims reviewed should include an evaluation of all state and federal Medicaid laws, the laws that govern the provider's profession, and all obligations under the Medicaid provider agreement related to the claims. The provider may suggest the audit period they wish to review, as well as issues to be addressed if conducting a focused review. While the agency wishes to encourage all providers to submit self-audits, it is better for the provider and the agency if the provider will first submit a written plan describing how they intend to conduct the audit, as well as describing the audit period and focus of the review. This will help ensure that the provider is given needed guidance and will increase the likelihood that the agency will validate the audit and accept the findings. Additionally, providers with voluminous claims history to be subject to the self-audit may wish to use the agency's statistical methodology to conduct a review of a sample of claims only. All of these details can be discussed with the self-audit coordinator with the agency's Bureau of Medicaid Program Integrity. As a reminder, if a provider is already under investigation by any federal or state agency, such as the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, Medicaid Program Integrity, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or any other federal or state entity, please do not perform a self-audit without discussing the matter with the Medicaid Program Integrity Self-Audit Coordinator. Oftentimes, the other investigation can proceed at the same time as the self-audit, and many times a provider knows that the other investigation is going to conclude with the provider being obligated to conduct a self-audit. Before the agency can accept a self-audit from a provider who is under investigation by any other federal or state entity, the agency would need to obtain approval from the entity conducting the investigation. There are two ways a provider may come up with the concept to conduct a self-audit. One is their voluntary disclosure as a part of their compliance program, and the other is when the agency offers them an opportunity to participate in an amnesty program. Because Florida law requires the agency to sanction providers for instances of noncompliance, except when the agency grants amnesty from sanctions, providers can benefit by voluntarily repaying overpayments and avoiding sanctions. The sanctions are described in several different provisions of contracts and rules, but the most common Medicaid sanctions are described in Rule 59G-9.070, Florida Administrative Code. The sanctions can include fines, suspension, or termination from the Medicaid program. Recent changes to the sanction rule have significantly increased the fines that will follow agency determinations of noncompliance. If for no other reason, this is why a Medicaid provider would want to perform a self-audit, and thus we are encouraging providers to voluntarily engage in the process of ensuring their compliance with the Medicaid program rules. The sanction rule can be found on the website for the Florida Administrative Code at www.flrules.org. Again, www.flrules.org. When the agency institutes an amnesty program, a provider will receive notice from the agency of a specific matter to be addressed by way of the self-audit, along with other pertinent audit parameters, such as the time period for review or specific claims to review, and will be directed to complete the self-audit within a specified time frame if they wish to take advantage of the offer for amnesty from sanctions. Providers who avail themselves of the opportunity within the time frame afforded by the agency will benefit from the amnesty provisions. Providers who do not avail themselves of this opportunity will be subject to audit by the agency and will be subject to sanctions that may follow as a result of violations discovered during the audit. The basic principle of how to conduct a self-audit is really quite simple. Evaluate claims for reimbursement, and for any reimbursement that you have determined was in excess of the amount that should have been paid, return the improper amount to the state. Excess payment can occur for a variety of reasons. Any amount of reimbursement that should not have been paid to you, whether it was due to an error or mistake, is an overpayment. The agency will require supporting documentation to be submitted so that the self-audit could be replicated, if needed, for validation purposes. You may still not be sure why a provider would ever want to disclose non-compliances to the state. We have tried to reiterate that a self-audit has several advantages for providers. By conducting a self-audit, a Medicaid provider has more control over the parameters of the audit. That means they can select the time period of claims to review. They can determine the length of time that the review will cover, and they can select the focus of the review, as opposed to the state establishing the review parameters. A self-audit is also more educational for the provider, which results in a greater likelihood of future compliance and less opportunity for future overpayments and sanctions. From a provider's perspective, self-audits are not only the right thing to do, but are the most cost-effective thing to do. The expense of the audit process is generally less for a provider who conducts a self-audit, as opposed to when the agency conducts the audit and investigative costs are recovered. And if a self-audit is accepted by the agency and the overpayment is repaid, a provider avoids being sanctioned for the voluntary disclosure of non-compliance. The savings to a provider for conducting their own audit, as opposed to waiting to see if the agency will find the non-compliance, is evident. The agency utilizes auditors, has managers, and sometimes agency attorneys involved with their reviews. There is a clinician and other consultants that may be used. These expenses are all passed on to the provider. When the provider conducts the audit himself or herself, the audit expenses are minimal. More significantly, with regard to cost savings, is that a self-audit which is accepted by the agency affords the provider amnesty from sanctions, which include costly fines. In order for the agency to validate a provider's self-audit so that it can be accepted and the provider can repay the overpayment to be afforded amnesty, the agency needs certain documentation about the provider and the claims at issue. The agency will need complete information about the provider to ensure that the audit can be accepted. The billing provider's information must include the complete name, address, provider type, provider information number, the tax identification number, as well as the name, address, and telephone number of the designated contact for the provider regarding the self-audit. The agency will also need information about how the provider conducted the review so that the agency can be assured that it was conducted appropriately. This information should include a detailed description regarding the audit methodology and overpayment calculation used in the self-audit, as well as any other information that would allow verification of the claim. This sample worksheet provides an example of how a provider could submit their audit findings. As we take a look at the sample, we will discuss the information that could be put on a worksheet or form like this example. Please remember, this is an example intended to assist you and that you may use any format you'd like, so long as you include the information needed to validate the findings. As we discussed previously, the audit findings need to include the provider name and Medicaid provider identification number, as well as the date of the audit, the provider type, and the single point of contact for any questions that the agency may have. We also need a telephone number and address to be able to communicate with the provider. The tax ID and National Provider Identifier, or NPI, will assist us in ensuring accurate tracking so that if the self-audit is accepted, it can be filed and the claims that were reviewed would be documented in the agency files as having been audited. We also need the time period or audit period covered in the self-audit. These are all things that could simply be listed at the top of a document or form, such as the example we are providing here, and will demonstrate on the next slide. Using something similar to our sample form, a provider could easily list the information that is needed for the agency for basic administrative purposes. We have highlighted those areas that are used to assist the agency in keeping track of the audit. Now let's discuss the information that will help the agency understand how the audit was conducted. The agency will need to have some details about the type of audit that has been conducted, whether it used sampling, focused on a particular issue, or evaluated all claims during the audit period. In the example form that we have shown you, you can see that we suggest indicating the audit type. Simply whether you did an audit of your entire practice, meaning all types of claims you bill, or whether you focused the review on a particular issue. We also suggest that you identify whether you used statistical sampling, and if so, whether you obtained the sample from ACA or pulled the sample yourself. We also would like to have you provide a little bit of information about how the audit was conducted, the audit methodology. This explanation doesn't have to be written in formal auditing terminology. Simply describe what you did from the point of identifying the claims to review, what things you looked for in the review, what records and documentation were a part of the review, and who conducted the review. We recommend that you submit as detailed of a description as you can. The last part of the audit submission would be the audit findings. When you get to the point of identifying the claims that you have reviewed, we need specific information so that we can review the claims in our databases. You can submit a spreadsheet in an electronic format which identified every claim that was subject to the review with the review findings. Some claims would be found to be compliant, while others would be reported as non-compliant. The agency needs to know the date of service, the date of payment, the procedure code, and, as applicable, the units of service, the name and ID for the treating provider, the recipient's name and ID number, the claim number, or ICN, and a description of the findings. When looking at our example form, a provider could use a table such as the one at the bottom half of this example to submit the audit findings. The provider would list each claim reviewed with the necessary details and then include whether the claim was found to be appropriately billed or not. ACA often will use the terms allow, disallow, or adjust to represent whether you determined that the claim was properly billed, thus should be allowed, was not properly billed, and should not have been reimbursed, thus disallowed, or when a lesser code should have been billed instead, so you may want to wish to indicate that the claim should be adjusted. We also ask that you provide us with a brief explanation about why you found that the claim should be disallowed or adjusted downward. This will help us expedite the review and acceptance process. When a provider is identifying claims as non-compliant, it is pertinent to the agency to know what is the basis for the non-compliance. Therefore, the agency requests that the non-compliant claims be identified with a description that explains what was wrong with the claim. Some examples would be if the services were not rendered, the coding level was in error, the claim was for brand drugs when a generic was dispensed, the level of staff performing the services was not proper under Medicaid rules or the provider's practice standards, the claim referenced the wrong date of service or an incorrect recipient, the claim was for services that were reimbursed under another code or claim, claims were billed for unbundled services that should have been billed using a global code or panel, or the services were not documented in accordance with Medicaid requirements. One of the most common questions providers have about agency audits or the validation process for a self-audit is, how long will it take? The verification of a provider self-audit will depend, in a large part, upon the submission to the agency. If at any time during the process a provider has questions or concerns, they should always feel free to contact the agency's representatives. Most self-audits will be processed through the agency's Bureau of Medicaid Program Integrity. They have a designated self-audit coordinator who handles the processing of all self-audits. The contact information for the self-audit coordinator is available on the agency's website. By using the site menu, you can navigate to the Medicaid page. There are quick links on the right-hand side of the main Medicaid page. The Fraud and Abuse quick link takes you to a page with information about reporting fraud and abuse and conducting self-audits. The MPI Self-Audit Coordinator's email address is posted on this page at ahca.myflorida.com/Medicaid/abuse/index.html. Upon completion of the agency's review of the self-audit, the audit will either be accepted or declined. Accepted audits will result in the issuance of a final agency action letter stating the amount of money to be repaid and providing repayment instructions. Audits that are not accepted will be returned to the provider for corrections, with an explanation regarding why the audit could not be accepted. If the self-audit is accepted by the agency and you have received a final agency action letter with repayment instructions, you need to comply with those instructions and ensure that you make payment to remedy the overpayment. If you do not remedy the overpayment, the amnesty protections will not apply to the self-disclosure, which means you will be sanctioned for the non-compliance you disclosed, and you will be sanctioned for any non-payment of the amount due to the agency. While conducting a self-audit does ensure that you are returning improper payments to the agency and helps you minimize your risk for sanctions, it does not mean that the agency will not audit your claims and doesn't preclude the agency or any other regulatory or law enforcement agency from conducting an investigation or review of your billings. It is critical, though, that you keep copies of all your self-audit information and documentation for future reference. This will help you later should another entity attempt to collect the same overpayment from you that you have already disclosed and returned. If you receive a letter from the agency offering you an opportunity to conduct a self-audit in lieu of an agency-conducted audit, please follow the instructions in that letter regarding who to contact with questions or who to submit your review findings to. However, if you are conducting a self-audit on your own initiative, we thank you and ask that you send the review findings to the agency's self-audit coordinator. Please send the review findings to the Agency for Healthcare Administration, Medicaid Program Integrity Unit, with attention to the Self-Audit Coordinator at 2727 Mahan Drive, MS number 6, Tallahassee, Florida 32308. In closing, please remember that if you wish to conduct a self-audit, you should contact the agency's Office of Inspector General, Bureau of Medicaid Program Integrity's Self-Audit Coordinator, whose contact information is shown here. To obtain additional information about provider compliance or to submit questions that arise after this presentation, please contact Kelly Bennett at kelly.bennett, BENNETT, at ahca.myflorida.com. We encourage all providers to incorporate a compliance program into their business right away. This would include beginning to do routine self-audits. How often you may want to conduct self-audits depends on your claim volume and your resources to conduct the audits. However, we generally recommend annual audits, but providers with higher claim volumes may wish to do them more frequently. We thank you for your time and look forward to providing you with more learning opportunities.